1935, the Lions win the NFL championship. The Detroit Tigers take the World Series. The Red Wings bring home Lord Stanley's Cup. Joe Louis begins his rise to world domination. This transforms the Motor City into Detroit, City of Champions.
All right, there you go. Anchors away. It is time for Detroit, City of Champions, the podcast. I'm Jamie Flanagan.
Charles Avison.
And just lots of stuff happening. And we just did an episode of the Man Cave Happy Hour in here. Had a bunch of people hanging out, and now we're moving on to Detroit, the City of Champions. And what's too loud? The music?
The
headphones?
Into the headphones.
Oh, you're good. And
All
I'm
right.
just shouting because I got a little bit of a cold, so I'm screaming.
Oh, okay.
That's why I think I'm screaming. But I think I had a cold because we were sitting in that cold factory all last week for 2 episodes.
That was a blast to go to do that show.
It was the
man.
best.
It was so cool.
Ever. I think I enjoyed that more than when we were in the historical museum.
Yeah, oh yeah, totally. Roger was great.
Because I think Roger made it.
Yeah, totally. Roger
so
was.
much
I
better.
learned a ton, man.
Yep.
And having Miss America 10 in the background was like the coolest thing. Like
literally just to reach behind you
Yeah,
and touch the
it
boat
was
that
right
we were
there.
talking about
Yeah.
as it was happening. That was so fun to do. But the Miss America story, Miss America 10, her story is not done.
No, we're just getting rolling on that.
We just got to drop her in the water. And we're like looking at those engines and those 4 engines, and he's like talking about how he was laying on the floor and mapping it out. He goes, "No, we'll put them end to end."
And they're like, "You can't do that
he
because you're
goes-
going to be like putting a bomb in an egg crate."
He goes, I'm the one strapping it to my back.
I'm the
so
one that's got to do it.
I got to drive it.
And I was thinking, I was putting the notes together for tonight's show. I was like, oh shoot, there was so many. There was a couple of just unbelievable quotes and like the genesis of the idea for the Miss America 10.
Right.
And I was like, should we revisit? Should I bring those quotes back for today just to make sure that whoever's listening to this show hears it? And it's like we can't because we got even more awesome quotes and stuff to talk about tonight.
Right.
And so if you didn't listen to last week's show, you got to go back and listen to it because it's got some great stuff for like the genesis of the Miss America 10, like the reasons for it coming into being, the engines, all that stuff. The one of the greatest hymns of praise, like poems ever, like J. Lee Barrett talking about like God of Vulcan, the Vulcan God of forged, created these engines and whatever. They're just like the greatest little poem. So we don't have time to talk about all that again. I would like I say, it's the coolest thing. So if you didn't listen to last week's show, you got to go back and listen to the genesis of the of the engine, of the boat, the idea and everything. But it's because we're moving right along today.
Yeah.
Episode 63, The Madman's Dream.
The Madman's Dream.
Yep. We've already kind of alluded to it last week when we said the Madman's Dream was the Miss America 10.
Yeah.
But
nut.
but it's just such a cool title. I was like, I couldn't help it. I want to make sure everybody recognizes because that's what they called this boat.
Right.
The Miss America 10, the nickname of it was the Madman's Dream. And we talked about the genesis of it, like I say, last week and why it was called the Madman's Dream. But today it plays a central role, so that's why I wanted to make sure that the episode titles that. So.
Yeah, well, he was like, "You're gonna blow yourself up. What are you doing?"
Yeah, so things are getting crazy. It's 1931 rolling into 1932.
All right,
and we talked about Miss England 2. Garwood Garwood in the previous year, 1931, had gotten beat in the first heat by the Miss England 2. This is the English, British are absolutely dedicated to bringing back the Harmsworth Trophy to England, and the Miss England 2 wins the first heat, which was like incredible to all. This first race that Garwood had lost, and then the second heat they rebuilt the boat and everything, and then Garwood ends up there's engine problems for the Miss England 2, and Garwood wins, but. They had the Yankee. They called it the Yankee trick, which was kind of one of the things that gave rise to Garwood's nickname as the Gray Fox of the Algonac, which is where he acted like he was going to beat K. Don to the line, and K. Don tried to catch up with him, and they both got disqualified, and Garwood's other boat made it around the track. And so there's there's all kinds of things that are under the scenes, and they're like, we had a better boat, we should have won this race, they had a year to sort of be like we got jobbed if got, to say like we didn't we're gonna beat them this next race, the next time we're challenging them again for sure. And they took a page out of Garwood's book because the Miss America 9, the only reason it had any chance whatsoever against the superior Rolls-Royce engines, the Rolls-Royce engines that they created for the Miss England 2, was that the Garwood had added superchargers to the two engines, and added a little bit more juice, but it just the tail of the tape, you had the Miss England 2 had 3,600 horsepower. The Miss America 9 had 3,200, so it was not anywhere. It wasn't. I mean, it was somewhat close, but that was only maxing out the two engines. And so in 1932, the English are Garwood sort of leads off the year in January with he takes the Miss America 9 across a measured mile in Florida. He takes it a couple times and he breaks the world record. He breaks the K-Don's world record.
Wow.
And so he takes the world record back. Garwood does, and then the English, they're learning their lesson from Garwood adding superchargers to his engines. They supercharged the engines for the Miss England 3, so now they've got a new boat. They've got new engines. I mean, it's the same basic engines, but they add superchargers. So they increase the Miss England 3 increases to 4,000 horsepower.
Oh boy,
which dwarfs the Miss America 9, which again is 3,200. So that's when we were talking about all the stuff that went into creating the Miss America 10, which was Garwood knew he's not going into in 1932. He's not going into racing.
I'm not going to a gunfight with a knife.
Exactly,
right?
And so that's what leads to this. He's saying, to the madman's dream, which is like they can't. There's no increasing the amount. There's no more tweaking the engines to get any more juice out of them.
These two engines, you're maxed.
Yeah, we're maxed out. So the only thing to do is to tether them together and make one giant, with four engines and make two ridiculously huge engines that all function as one. That have two completely different engines, and that's why it was the madman's dream, because you're tethering two engines together to create one super engine.
That's nuts.
I know. That's what they're like.
Well, it does it.
How do you tie these engines together?
Well, Garwood thought.
Yes, Garwood thought of it.
Wood thought it would work, but who would It does sound dangerous.
Yes, because the main danger part is the tethering of the engines to get them to function as one, and that's the rod that goes in between them. That when the thing's firing, like I'm not the biggest knowledgeable about engines, but in order the main drive shaft that pumps it all has got to be functioning as one thing. And that's really the core component. That's the strength of the entire engine, because if you got that much muscle turning that rod, that rod's got to be made of like adamantium steel, like Wolverine's claws, in order so it doesn't rip apart. And that was good, as we're going to see, that's going to be what turns out to be one of the biggest issues.
Oh,
so anyways, the Miss America 9, Garwood sets the record, and then the Miss England 3 with these new supercharged Rolls-Royce engines. Shortly thereafter, in February, in Loch Lomond, Scotland, it goes from 111 miles an hour, which is Garwood's record, to 119 miles an hour, which is 119.82 miles an hour, which is the Miss England 3.
Yeah.
So he dwarfs Garwood's speed on water, and again issues the challenge for the 1932 Harmsworth in Detroit. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, we're coming back for it, and this time we're going to win. So the Miss America. So one of the things we didn't talk about in the last week's show about the Miss America 10 was that this boat was so big, which we saw was just an absolutely ridiculously large boat. I mean, this thing for a speedboat, it's just monstrous,
huge.
And so anyways, one of the things though was that the horsepower behind this thing, it ended up being 6,400 horsepower when it was done. So we said, once again, a comparison: Miss England 3, 4,000 horsepower. Miss America 10, 6,400. Man. So this is a next level. But in order to make the problem is that you're using a wood boat.
Yeah.
So as we talked about in the very I think the first episode, is the goal was to get the boat out of the water onto its plane, right, which is a flat bottom on the back of the boat. The problem is that they were like, well, wood would never take the punishment of this of the energy that this thing can take, that this thing's going through the water. Like it'll just strip the bottom of the boat off of it.
Right.
So they're like, so the only thing that they can do is make the plane made of metal. So the entire goal is to make the plane on the bottom of the boat made of metal, and to get it to plane so that it would ride on that plane when it was hitting that 126 or whatever miles an hour it was going to be hitting. So it had to ride on the plane. That was the entire thing. If it didn't ride on the plane, then it was, you know what I mean, it was too much drag in the water. And so anyways, that's the goal. And also, of course, to keep those, keep the engines tethered as one. And so we also mentioned last week, the test driving, when they test drove, we did that when they test drove this thing, this thing is running, as far as fuel efficiency, it's sort of a modern day topic. Fuel efficiency, this boat is running at, we talk about how many miles a gallon a car gets.
Yeah.
Well, this thing, we talk about how many gallons per mile, because this boat, it's taking 5 gallons a mile to push this thing. Which is like, like this is the only vehicle I think I've ever heard of. It's about how many gallons per mile you get the other way around.
Yeah.
So anyways, that's where this thing is at. So they take the boat out for a test run, and the boat. And I think we read that quote last week. The boat is not opened up at full throttle during the test run. So they're like, okay, hold on one second. Let me take a look at it. So we did. I think we did read that quote. The boat. That's right. We did read the quote. So the boat is taken out for test run. We read that quote last week where they take it out and they're like, I think we left off in the end of the quote where he said, it'll do. He's like, they're like, hey, Gar, how did it run? He's like, it'll do. But one of the things we didn't talk about is that they didn't open it up to its max limits. They took it out for a test drive to make sure everything was functioning. And then so then they took it out. And then what they found out was, 9 days prior to the race, which is after that first test run, they take the boat out and they say, let's max it out and see what it can do.
Yeah.
And so when they take it out 9 days prior to the race, they take it out and they push it up to its max capacity, and all the connecting rods and the engines all snap.
Oh, jeez.
So the whole thing basically is just, it just limps back to shore. I don't even know I think they had to get towed back to shore. But so it is, and this is 9 days prior to the race. So in true Garwood fashion,
rip it apart.
Rip it.
Let's rebuild this bad boy.
Worst. So I have my notes say
from the nuts and bolts up.
Worst possible scenario is as all 4 engines had to be removed, torn apart, rebuilt with new custom rods in time for the boat to be tested again.
Jesus.
Right. So they have 9 days to do it. So worst possible scenario, because the engines have to be, the rods that connect them, the engines have to be torn apart, new rods, custom rods, with a whole new type of metal or something or other put in there. So that's where we get to like sort of the first quote that I want to read. And again, the J. Lee Barrett quotes are so great. Usually for all the other subjects, we read little quotes here and there. Yeah. Some of these ones we've been reading are a little bit more extensive, but it's just because they're so good. He's one of the most amazing writers. And I said this before, the Speedboat Kings book, I've read a lot of history books, but the Speedboat Kings is one of my, it doesn't even matter what subject you're talking about. He's just one of the best. He puts you right there. And we've got a couple of really good quotes to read today. And this is the first one. And it talks about, once again, and we've talked about this before, some of the greatest parts of the story of Garwood are not necessarily the races themselves. The races are almost kind of like an anticlimax to a certain extent. It's the efforts that it takes just to get the boat in the water and in time for the race and ready to go. And then it's like the fact that the boats even finished the race is a huge thing compared to every other component he's ever had. Like all these opponents, their boats half the time don't even finish the race because the engineering is so flawed. And that's Detroit, man. They're building boats and products that actually make it around the track and finish the race, So anyways, so now that all this takes us into the first, like I say, quote I want to read. J. Lee Barrett, of course, and this is talking about the effort, all the things that went into, getting this boat ready 9 days prior to the race. And I'll tell you this. So we've got really 2 giant quotes to read, and all of the stuff we're about to read takes place. This is what's so interesting. It takes place within a 12-day span.
Okay.
12-day span. Okay, keep that in mind. So anyway, so this is 9 days prior to the race. So So right here, men of lesser mettle would have surrendered the trophy to the English without a battle. Again, talking about the fact that the rod's broke in the boat and that they have to tear this thing apart. So I'm going to start over. Right here, men of lesser mettle would have surrendered the trophy to the English without a battle. It didn't look like they could design and manufacture new connecting rods, practically rebuild 4 giant engines, hook the 2 banks together again in tandem, and set them back in the hull in 9 short days. But they did. For 6 days and 6 nights, Wood's men and the Packard engineers worked. For 6 days and 6 nights, they didn't get home for one meal. For 6 days and 6 nights, they caught what snatches of sleep they could beside the engines. They wouldn't quit. On the 3rd day before the race, the engines were ready. They were rushed back to Algonac. It was a full 2 days' job to set them back into the hull. For 9 solid days, these men had worked, Wood and Johnson among them. No one but Wood's men and the Packard men knew about this. Few, very few, know it to this day. This isn't luck, it's work. Johnson and Vance Smith drove the Miss America 10 from Algonac across Lake St. Clair to Wood's Greyhaven home at Detroit the day before the race. Vance Smith was at the wheel, Johnson, as usual, at the throttles. A strong east wind was cutting diagonally across the bow of the boat, sifting the strong benzol gases into the cockpit of Johnson's side. About halfway across the lake, Vance turned to look at Johnson. His head and one arm were leaning over the side as though he were studying something there in the water. His left hand was clutching the throttle. Vance was anxious. Was there something wrong with the boat? Why didn't Johnson move? Vance tapped his riding mate on the shoulder. Still, Johnson didn't move. He was out, cold, unconscious from the sharp benzol gases that diagonal wind was sweeping to Johnson's side of the cockpit. Vance turned the 10th sharply to the left, headed the bow straight into the wind so that Johnson would get to the clean, fresh air on his side of the boat. Then Vance stood up in that bounding boat and worked on Johnson. He thought the man was dead. His body was limp, nerveless, senseless. For 10 minutes, Vance worked on his man out there alone in the middle of Lake St. Clair. Not another boat was in sight. And he worked fast. "Come on, kid," he kept saying. "They can't do without you in this race. Orland, for hell's sake, man, come on." Vance couldn't hear his own words over the roar of the engines, but he could see Johnson breathing. He knew the man was living, and he was getting air now. The gas is sweeping the other way. It was 10 minutes before Johnson spoke. He said, "What happened, Vance? Where are we?" Then he smiled. Guess I was out, huh? So this is the third time.
How many times has he almost died?
Near death.
Just driving this boat.
Yes, throat slit in one story.
There's no dead man. There's no dead man switch on this.
No.
He was out cold.
Yeah.
It's still full throttle.
Yeah, so one story,
God.
Orland gets his throat slit by a board, gets his jugular exposed, pronounced dead on the shore, makes it through it. Another story, the boat explodes in Italy. He ends up flying up 100 yards into the air, landing on his face or something, and bring him onto the dock. They took him to this whole dramatic scene where they did take him by boat to the hospital and all this. Survives. Here he inhales benzol and is out for 10 minutes from fumes of benzol fumes. And here, benzol fumes. I don't even know what that is, but it sounds good.
You should not be breathing.
It's like huffing. I mean, and you're talking about these massive engines spewing it into your face.
God, yeah.
I mean, this is toxic stuff we're talking about here. And he's out for 10 minutes and somehow comes out of it. Like, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, this is the third time. This guy is a third time. He's like almost dead. So this is the lead up to this race. So following this, following this situation, what they realized during these test runs was that the metal plane on the bottom of the boat was not planing.
Oh, okay.
So the boat was they ran a dozen tests like this where they're driving across Lake St. Clair testing the plane out, trying to get the boat up on its plane, and a dozen times they could not get this boat to plane, and they would take it back to the warehouse, readjust the plane, take it boat back out on the river, 5 gallons a mile, and it didn't plane again. And they would take it back, rework the plane, take it back out on the river, and it still wouldn't plane. Okay, so they do this. And they say this in a J. Lee Barrett. A dozen times they try to fix the metal plane on the bottom of this boat, and a dozen times it fails. And so they ran out of time. They ran out of time, and so they're going into the race at 7. This is. They never got it to plane going into the race against K-Don on the morning on this morning. So So the morning of the race. So now the next quote we're going to begin with is the morning of the race. And this is like some of my favorite writing of J. Lee Barrett. Like we're literally leaving into like some of the greatest, some of the greatest writing he has to say.
Yeah.
So this is the morning of the race. And so the first quote we're going to read is J. Lee Barrett waking up and he's just describing what he sees on the river. Okay. Because this is like, this race is so massively hyped. We talked about the last race being one of the largest, sporting events in human history. I think we made a pretty decent case a couple episodes ago for that race being. I mean, there was over 500,000 people at that race.
Yeah,
we could easily make a case for one of the largest sporting events in human history with that race. And now we're getting into this one, which is a rematch with even bigger stakes. And so this is J. Lee Barrett's sort of take on that. So here again, J. Lee Barrett, Speedboat Kings. The 1932 race for the trophy on Lake St. Clair was run at 7 o'clock in the morning. The officials agreed on the change. They felt that the water would be smoother at sunrise than at sundown. It wasn't, at least not for the first heat. Always in the background of my memory will hang the dim tapestry of these miserable hours before the race started. When I stepped out into that dark morning at 5 o'clock, I felt sure there would be no race, no spectators, nothing. A pitiless cold rain was driving down, and I knew that the course would be a sea of whitecaps. I felt like I was a lone figure of the night, standing thin and gaunt and cold against the black sky. I stepped into my car and drove down to the lake. I can't quite tell the feeling that swept through me at what I saw. Probably 1,000 stabbing, bobbing, disappearing lights out across the lake, moving in an almost endless string toward a common goal, the Harmsworth course. I knew what that meant, and I was amazed. They were the boats, canoes, rowboats, dinghies, cockleshells, sailboats, cruisers, yachts, runabouts, loaded to the gunwales with part of the race-mad crowds that throng to see these races every year. From a black, wind-broken sky, the rains came, and through that dim night, the drenched pageant moved across an angry sea like a specter. I couldn't help but fear for the safety of those people. They'd never get out into the higher waters of the lake without a wholesale tragedy. And we, the officials, the members of the race committee, were responsible. We had changed the course to Lake St. Clair to avoid possible disaster, and here before my eyes were 1,000 crowded, storm-tossed boats converging upon the Harmsworth course from all directions. This possibly was a disaster of a more wholesale kind than we had ever dreamed. There wasn't anything we could do, not now, and yet I couldn't help feel a tiny catch in the throat. It was a ghastly testimony of the hold these races have on the popular mind. I was a little proud that I had a small hand in staging this giant spectacle. I don't know how it was done. It seems miraculous now that not one fatality occurred. But when dawn broke and this curtain went up for the first act of this Harmsworth drama in 1932, they were there, 1,000 boats anchored around the rim of the course, waiting. Many of them were so loaded down with their human cargoes that the dangerous deep water was even now licking over their gunwales. Not only that, when the first faint streaks of light began to pick their way out of the east, we saw the shoreline banked solid with humanity for miles. They had driven, walked, pedaled, and skated their way to the race through all that cold September rain. And they were there now, a black, solid mass, drenched to the skin, but waiting for the starting gun of another Harmsworth battle. What sporting event had ever seized on a people's fancy like this? It's just poetry.
It's
poetry.
I love this writing.
What sporting event in the world had ever seized on a people's fancy like this?
Yeah.
We're watching it through his eyes.
Yeah.
This massive humanity on boats, on the shore, on everywhere you can be. They're there to watch in the driving rain into Michigan, September, around Lake St. Clair.
And then the wakes from the boat adding more trouble.
Yeah, well, he's worried about the fate of all these people. He's like, there's an immense human tragedy was befolding. And he's like, but there was like a sick fascination that I had something to do with the whole thing. He's like just honest and visualizing. He's telling us right through his eyes what he's seeing.
Somebody's gonna die today.
He's like, and I was kind of perversely enjoying the fact that I had like something to do with this spectacle.
Man.
No matter how it turns out, I had something to do with this. It's just like. He's just such a phenomenal writer, man. I mean, he's just a phenomenal. He paints a picture like. The screenplay for this, and I didn't write a screenplay for the Garwood story, but what else do you need? to describe the way the story is supposed to go, then like literally just to use J. Lee Barrett's words in narrative as the backdrop for the setting the stage for the scenes. So anyway, so that's just the lead up to the race, right? So the next, so that to kind of pick up with what what we were saying, the main issue going into the race for Garwood was that a dozen times they tried to get this boat to plane. They've got a metal plane in the back. Everything depends on this boat planing because the boat can't take the pounding on the wood. The engine's too much.
If it does that dolphin thing, you
exactly.
are done for.
You're done. It's going to chop up the boat. It's done. Exactly.
And you won't have the speed. Mm-hmm. You won't have the speed. And it'll probably rip the boat to shreds.
There you go. Exactly.
Those 4 engines will be at the bottom of Lake St. Clair.
And their boat might have more horsepower, but if the other boat has is skimming across the surface using all 4,000 of its horsepower, then you're done. So that's going to be like the main theme. So that's why I really want to drive that home is the issue is that there's 12 times going into this race. They're already on short schedule trying to rebuild all the engines. Right? They're already on a short schedule redoing all the engines, and they took it out a dozen times trying to get it to plane, and it never planed. So so this is like setting the stage for like what in a movie would be like one of the greatest sort of endings. I mean, we have a whole other episode to go, but this is one like you could leave it. You could almost leave it off at this story that we're about to read here as like the culmination, as a phenomenal culmination.
All right, and with that, we are going to take a little quick pause right here. Wrap up this episode of Detroit City of Champions, the podcast. Please, please, please like, subscribe, leave a comment wherever you're listening, watching. Tell a couple of friends. Truly appreciate it. Charles and I are having so much fun telling these stories, and that's the reason we do it. We want to get them out there and share them with people. So do us a favor, share them with a friend or two. It's Detroit City of Champions, the podcast. We're going to be right back with more in the next episode. We're kind of cutting it here because we kind of went on and on. But it's just an amazing day with Garwood, these amazing races with the Miss America 10 and the boats. And we're going to follow up with more from the Speedboat Kings, Garwood. It's Detroit City of Champions, the podcast.